It began as something so faint that Morty thought it might be his imagination, a kind of quiet vibration at the edges of things, in the walls, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the pauses between footsteps at night. The world was supposed to feel solid, ordinary, dependable in its small details, but lately it had started to shimmer at the corners, as if it were breathing in a rhythm he couldn't quite follow. He tried to dismiss it, to bury himself in the simple distractions of school, of television, of sleep. But the whisper would not leave. It curled softly around him, more felt than heard. A murmur threaded through existence itself. At first it frightened him. He thought of ghosts, of hidden watchers, of all the things Rick half-joked about when he wanted to unsettle Morty. But over time, the sound became less like a threat and more like a song, something old, something constant, something that seemed to be waiting for him to notice. Morty would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though the house itself was carrying him somewhere, as though the shadows in his room were gentler than they had ever been. It was in those quiet hours that he began to wonder if the world had always been this way, full of subtle signs and strange rhythms, or if he was only now starting to notice. Maybe the whisper had been there since the beginning, in his mother's tired sighs, in his father's distracted laugh, in Rick's careless mutterings that sounded like nonsense but carried a weight Morty couldn't quite define. Maybe reality had always been less certain than he was told, more delicate, more alive. And though the thought left him uneasy, there was also a softness in it, as though the mystery itself was reaching out to hold him. He didn't have words for it, not yet, but something deep inside knew the hum was not an end. It was an invitation. Rick had noticed it long before Morty did. The pauses, the stutters, the way the world would sometimes repeat itself like a record catching on a scratch. He never explained it outright, not in the way teachers explained equations or parents explained rules. Instead, he tossed pieces of truth at Morty in fragments, half buried in sarcasm, like pebbles skipping across a pond. "Reality's got loose threads, Morty," he muttered one evening, eyes hazy but sharp beneath the weight of his words. "You pull one, and the whole sweater starts looking less like clothing, more like yarn." At first Morty resisted. He didn't want to believe that the world around him could slip, that the whisper he had been feeling wasn't just imagination. But then there were the glitches, a car looping the same turn twice, a stranger's laugh repeating in a rhythm too precise, a bird pausing mid-flight as though it had forgotten its own wings. Little fractures in the ordinary, small enough to doubt, clear enough to unsettle. Rick watched Morty notice these things, never rescuing him from the discomfort, only guiding him just enough to keep him from falling apart. "You think strangeness is the enemy?" Rick said, leaning back, voice like a lantern's glow in the dark. "But sometimes it's the only thing telling you the truth. Terrifying, sure, but also comforting, because it means you're awake." And though Morty shivered at the thought, though his chest ached with the weight of not knowing what was real, he also felt something loosening inside him. The world was not as fixed as he'd been taught, but maybe that was a kind of kindness too, that nothing was so rigid it couldn't change, that even the glitches had their own quiet beauty. It was frightening, yes, but in the tremble of it, there was a strange kind of comfort, like holding someone's hand in the dark and realizing they were trembling too. Morty found himself watching the world differently now, not as a boy swallowed by fear, but as someone tracing the seams of a fragile fabric. The cracks were everywhere once he allowed himself to see them. Street lamps flickered in rhythm with no power source to explain them. Conversations folded in on themselves like déjà vu, stretched too thin. And sometimes in the corner of his eye, the sky itself seemed to ripple, as though it were nothing more than a painted veil. He tried to look away at first, to retreat into the safety of denial, but the whisper Rick had planted lingered in him like an ember that refused to die. The strangeness didn't always come as threat. At times it felt oddly tender, as though the world itself was gently confessing its imperfection. Morty began to realize that these moments carried a strange gift, the chance to see life not as solid stone, but as breath, fleeting and delicate. His unease softened into curiosity. He would stand longer at the edges of the glitching moments, letting the odd loops and bends brush against him like cold water on his skin. Rick's voice hovered in the background, sometimes gruff, sometimes nearly kind. "You don't gotta fix it, Morty," he said, not even looking up from his clutter of tools. "Just notice it. That's all reality really asks, to be noticed, even when it's messy." And Morty held on to that, even when the air trembled with unreliability, even when his own heartbeat felt like part of the simulation's pulse. The more he leaned in, the less terrifying it became. What once made him shrink now made him wonder. He thought of dreams, of how they unravel just as you begin to grasp them, and he understood that perhaps this world, too, was not meant to hold forever. It was meant to be felt, to be carried, even as it slipped, in the quiet hum of bending streets and repeating voices. Morty's fear gave way to something gentler, a fragile, trembling kind of awe. The strangeness of the world didn't disappear, but Morty found himself less alone inside it. Rick's sharp words, still cut like glass, carried on the dry rasp of a man who had lived too long with secrets, yet beneath them, Morty could sense something else, an unwilling tenderness, a gravity that pulled them close even as Rick pretended to push away. The boy listened differently now. He no longer bristled at the bark of Rick's impatience, but searched instead for the pauses between the unsaid care stitched into grumbles and mutters. One evening, when the simulation flickered so violently the walls around them bent like liquid, Morty steadied himself without reaching for escape. Rick noticed, though he said nothing. A faint smirk brushed his face, almost hidden, almost ashamed. In that silence, Morty felt the trust grow, not loud or obvious, but like a seed pressing through soil in the dark. The testing continued in small ways. Rick snapped. Morty softened. Morty stumbled. Rick steadied. Their rhythm became something like breathing. One exhale, rough. The next inhale, gentle. Both necessary, both bound to the same cycle. What surprised Morty most was not the glitches or the mysteries, but the realization that he no longer wished to face them alone. The simulation could bend, break, and hum with unreality, yet within its cracks, Morty felt a truth more stable than the walls around him, that trust can bloom even in fractured places, and that even the sharpest edges can hold in their core the warmth of connection. The deeper Morty sank into the simulation, the harder it became to separate the shimmer of illusion from the pulse of what might be real. Streets stretched endlessly, then folded in on themselves, faces repeated, familiar yet slightly wrong, their smiles too still, their voices caught in loops that frayed at the edges. Every step carried the weight of uncertainty, as though the ground beneath him was less earth and more memory, fragile and unstable. Rick moved through it all with his usual swagger, but Morty began to notice the tightness in his grandfather's jaw, the quick dart of his eyes, scanning for seams. Even Rick, with all his bravado, was not immune to the fragility pressing down on them. Morty felt it most in quiet moments, when laughter echoed from nowhere, or when a tree dissolved into static, as though it had never existed. The world was heavy not because it was solid, but because it was fragile, like glass stretched thin, threatening to crack with every breath. Yet the more it bent and faltered, the more Morty learned to steady himself within it. He stopped reaching for certainty, stopped demanding the difference between truth and fabrication. Instead, he let the uncertainty settle in his chest, a strange kind of acceptance that, real or not, the feelings it stirred were his own. That weight was frightening. Yes, but also freeing, because even in a false world, his choices, his care, his trust in Rick felt undeniably alive. As the fragile edges of the world shimmered around him, Morty began to notice the hum beneath it all. a faint vibration that wove through the silence, softer than breath, steadier than thought. At first it unsettled him, like the background buzz of a machine that never shuts off. But the longer he listened, the more it slipped into him like a lullaby, carrying a rhythm that smoothed his fear into something gentler. It was as if the simulation itself was whispering, not to deceive, but to soothe, to remind him that even a false song could cradle the heart. He walked slower now, not chasing answers, but letting the melody guide his steps. Each flicker of unreality, each vanishing object, no longer felt like loss, but like a note in the strange symphony surrounding him. Rick muttered about patterns, about systems and failures in the code, but Morty heard something more, something tender tucked in the glitches, as if the very fabric of this false reality wanted him to rest inside its imperfection. And within that hum, Morty felt reflection rising, unhurried and deep. Maybe truth didn't matter as much as the feeling of being here, now, even in a place made of shadows. Maybe the weight he carried could be softened by listening, by allowing the lullaby of unreality to fold him inward. In the code's quiet whispers, Morty discovered a calm that was not dependent on answers, only on presence, and that was enough to carry him forward. Rick's words broke through the hum like sparks, sharp, crooked, but glowing just enough to catch Morty's attention. He never spoke gently, not really, yet there was a kind of light hidden in his mutterings, as if the roughness itself was a shield for something truer beneath. Morty, walking in the strange twilight of the simulation, began to see his grandfather less as a storm and more as a lantern, flickering, unpredictable, but refusing to go out. Every time Morty's steps faltered, Rick's voice was there, grumbling about the futility of meaning, mocking the very code they stood in, yet still shaping the path forward. It wasn't comfort in the usual sense, it was guidance dressed in jagged edges, but somehow it steadied Morty's heart. The shadows of unreality bent closer, testing him, but Rick's brilliance cut through just enough, reminding him that even cynicism could carry warmth if you listened with the right kind of patience. Morty realized then that love didn't always sound soft, and wisdom didn't always arrive clean. Sometimes it stumbled, cursed, and burned, yet still lit the way when everything else seemed ready to fade. In the half-light of glitching worlds, Rick shone against the dark, and Morty, without fully saying it, trusted that faint, uneven glow to guide him deeper. The simulation no longer pulsed with threat, but with a gentler, lingering hush, as though the world had tired of its own illusions and now rested in dim twilight. Morty walked beside Rick through the fading patterns of code that shimmered faintly like distant fireflies, and though no monsters leapt, no sudden terrors cracked the surface, the quiet itself carried a weight. Every step Morty took felt deliberate, not because he had to be cautious, but because he knew the moment itself was fragile, worth holding. He looked at Rick, who never stopped muttering half-formed theories under his breath, words stitched from science and sarcasm, yet Morty could sense the edges where those mutters softened into care. Rick didn't reach for his hand, didn't offer grand reassurances, but in the way his gaze lingered just long enough to check if Morty was still walking steady, Morty felt it. They did not speak much. Words felt too heavy, too sharp, and the silence between them was kinder. In that silence lived a thread of survival, two figures moving through a half-real world, carrying both the exhaustion and the tenderness of having made it through. When Morty stumbled, Rick's hand twitched, pretending it was nothing, but it steadied him nonetheless. When Rick paused, sighing into the dim, Morty stayed near, not pressing with questions, simply letting his presence say what words could not. The bond they shared was not forged in grand gestures or victorious moments, but in these smaller exchanges, the quick glance, the quiet patience, the unspoken acknowledgement that they needed each other, not as hero and sidekick, not as genius and apprentice, but as survivors of something stranger and larger than they could name. And in that fragile quiet, Morty felt both smaller and stronger, as though survival was not about conquering, but about walking beside someone who would not let the world, however false or fractured, swallow them whole. It began softly, almost kindly, as though the world itself were exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The edges of buildings blurred first, lines bending into haze, windows melting into ripples of light that no longer remembered how to be glass. Streets lost their firmness, the ground beneath Morty's feet shifting from stone to shimmer, and even the air carried a faint unraveling hum, like threads being pulled from a woven cloth. There was no alarm, no violent shatter, only inevitability, a quiet surrender of a place that had pretended too long. Morty felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a tender ache, as if watching a memory fade while still wanting to hold it close. Rick watched too, his face unreadable, though his silence spoke louder than his sharp words ever did. He knew this collapse was part of the design, the only way for the false to make room for what was real again. Yet, even he lingered on the sight of a lamppost flickering like a candle before winking away, or a fragment of sky peeling back to reveal the nothingness beneath. Morty's steps slowed, each one deliberate, as if to honor what was passing. He touched the outline of a wall as it thinned, fingers brushing through its glow until it dissolved into his hand, leaving only warmth. The world did not die in chaos, it drifted away like smoke, curling into the night. Morty felt a hush settle over him, a recognition that endings need not roar to be profound. Side by side, he and Rick walked through the dissolving simulation, neither rushing, neither resisting, but carrying with them the fragile weight of what they had seen and shared, knowing it was already slipping into memory. As the last fragments of the world slipped into nothingness, Morty realized the collapse had not taken everything. What mattered most had not dissolved into static or drifted into the hollow spaces between breaths. Even with the scenery gone, even with streets, skies, and buildings erased as though they were dreams at dawn, there was a weight that remained, a presence that no simulation could counterfeit. It was in the steady rhythm of Rick's footsteps beside him, in the memory of Annie's gentle glance, in the faint echo of laughter that had once felt fragile but now seemed eternal. Morty felt the ache of parting, the quiet truth that illusions cannot stay, no matter how much we cling to them. Yet within that ache was a strange comfort that what fades is not wasted, and what is real does not vanish with the walls of an invented world. He understood, in the softness of that moment, that love does not require permanence, and truth is not lessened by its fragility. Some bonds live not in the world they are built within, but in the hearts that carry them forward. So Morty let the last pieces fall away, not in sorrow but in reverence. He whispered his goodbye not to the collapsing illusions, but to the fear of losing them, and in that release he felt something steady beneath him. Not a flaw, not a world, but the quiet trust that even in endings, something true remains. Rick's words spilled out the way they always did, tangled with formulas, grunts, and sharp mutterings about atoms and code, about layers of simulation stacked on each other like mirrors reflecting mirrors. To anyone else it might have sounded like noise, a rush of jargon meant to confuse or impress, but Morty had been walking beside him long enough to hear something else beneath it. In the gaps, in the pauses where Rick's voice softened almost imperceptibly, Morty caught the outlines of something gentler, a philosophy hidden in the cracks. Rick wasn't just talking about algorithms or matter bending under the weight of observation. He was talking about impermanence, about the fragility of worlds, whether real or false. He was reminding Morty, perhaps without meaning to, that everything collapses eventually, simulations, bodies, even stars, and yet that collapse does not erase the beauty of their being. It lingers, like warmth after a fire, like a memory that hums long after the voice has gone quiet. Morty listened more closely than he ever had before. He felt Rick's science not as cold fact, but as tender truth, that wonder and sorrow share the same root, that even the smallest glitch in reality carries meaning if you let it. And though Rick never once admitted he cared, Morty felt cared for, carried by the quiet lantern glow of wisdom disguised as cynicism, love hidden inside equations. The hum that had carried them so long began to thin, stretched into silence like a thread pulled too far. Lights dimmed, not with drama but with a weary sigh, as though the simulation itself had grown tired of ending. Shapes that once pulsed with detail softened, edges fading, until they were little more than memory. Morty stood still, watching the last flicker ripple through the false horizon, not afraid but strangely calm, as if endings could be gentle too. Rick didn't rush, didn't curse the collapse or fight to hold it together. He only stood with hands tucked deep in his coat, eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of dying code. It was almost reverent, almost like he was giving the machine permission to rest. Morty could hear his own breath louder now, a reminder that even when worlds dissolve, something real lingers within him. The last flicker faded, the hum vanished, and what remained was silence, soft, absolute, folding around them like a blanket. The silence of the machine gave way to the cool breath of night, and Morty found himself once more beneath the vast sky that belonged to no program. Stars shimmered faintly, not perfect points of light, but budding, alive, as though the universe itself was exhaling. After holding too much in, he tilted his head back, the ache of everything he had seen pressing against his chest. Ruben's body collapsing, Annie's fleeting warmth, Rick's strange lantern glow in the dark. It was heavy, yes, but not crushing. It was the kind of weight that reminded him he was still here. Rick was already walking ahead, muttering to himself about circuits and scams, but Morty lingered. The night felt different now, not just an empty sky, but a mirror, vast and unblinking. He thought of illusions falling away, of how fragile everything was, yet how astonishing it felt to breathe beneath stars that were real. His heart slowed, softened, and for a moment he wished the world could always hum this quiet. He whispered nothing at all, just let the stillness hold him, and in that pause he understood that some things don't last, and that was what made them beautiful. And so, beneath that endless sky, the story did not end but merely folded itself into quiet. What had been lived became memory, and memory, in its tender persistence, became something softer still. Ruben's breath no longer echoed, Annie's touch was only a trace, and Rick's mutterings faded into the distance. Yet none of it was gone. It lingered in Morty's heart, in the hush of the night, in the way the stars seemed to lean closer, as if listening. Stories, after all, are not extinguished. They settle like dust on a windowsill, like warmth in cooling hands. Morty did not need to carry every detail, only the ache, only the wonder, only the love that remained when illusions dissolved. And as he breathed beneath the trembling constellations, the narrator's voice leaned close, gentle as sleep itself, reminding that nothing truly vanishes. It drifts, it softens, it becomes part of the dream.